10 to 15 of you who have not yet read Shadow. Is this true? True? There are some people, okay. As long as there are people who haven't read Shadow, we have to remember no spoilers. If you have a plot question about Shadow particularly, especially ones that start with, in chapter 14, when we meet blank, right? Remember, even just naming some of these characters represents a pretty big spoiler for somebody who hasn't read it yet. So let's try to be kind to our colleagues who are slightly behind us and ask those sorts of questions that don't wreck the surprise. So, who's going to be the first one to ask the professor a question? Yes, ma'am.
Are you going to develop that chromosomal line you had about her chromosome being a deviant chromosome making a witch?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question for those of you who are wrapped around the cash register over there. Am I going to develop the whole genetic angle, the chromosomes? Absolutely. It's a little hard to do that if you're in 1590. So I try to keep it kind of going through the plot of Shadow of Night. But obviously when we're back in the present with, lots of machines that go ping and laboratory equipment, we'll be a little bit better able to delve into those complexities. So you will definitely see more science back in the third book. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
When do you have time to write all of this if you're also being a professor?
Where do I find the time to do all that? I've gotten to the point where I'm a little like a medieval pope in that I don't actually seem to require more than about 5 or 6 hours of sleep, which is a good thing. I tend to write either first thing in the morning or last thing at night, i.e. when all of the hullabaloo of the day has passed. And because of the schedule of the tour, because I'm out here talking to all of you so late into the summer, I am actually taking leave next year simply because otherwise I would literally be running from the airport to the lecture hall with my textbook to lecture about the Italian Renaissance, which isn't fair to my students. So I'll have a little bit more time on my hands if you don't count all of this as taking up time, which does slightly, but anyway. Yes, ma'am.
So I just wonder about the third book. When will you have it out? Have you actually finished the book? And can you give us any, talent?
So as if not spoiling book 2 is bad enough. Okay, so about book 3. So here's the thing. I'm not finished book 3 yet. Now, this is not, now don't everybody panic immediately. I didn't finish Shadow of Night until January. Okay? So I have to finish it before they can put a publication date on it. So, and it takes me around a year to write, and I can't really see the finish line. I can't imagine when that will be at this point, and would hate to tell you. It is set in the present. There, as you know, for those of you who know where book 2 ends, that's where book 3 starts, exactly where we left off. I had a 15-year-old gentleman ask me at the end of Discovery of Witches whether or not there'd be dinosaurs in Shadow of Night, because he was convinced that I was going to throw some horrible plot twist in there. No, we're gonna pick up right where we left off. I like that. So we'll do that, and other than that, we're just going to have to see. But again, they've been spending the last 8-9 months with in a totally different world. They're not the same people. They've learned things in the past that changed them, and they're going back to a present that has also changed. So it will be a little bit of a bumpy re-entry on that end as well. All right. Yes, ma'am.
2 things. If when they get back to the future, they've twisted time a little bit just because of the length of time they've spent. Is any of that going to come back to haunt them, possibly, in the next book? Or you did such a really good job with Philippe and the nephew.
Yeah.
I found both of those characters quite intriguing.
Okay, so here's
to be their own storyline.
So will what's happened in the past somehow affect the future? Absolutely. I'm a historian. I believe the past always affects the future, even if we're not tracking it. So it would be pretty hard to avoid that. Well, again, it's not going to be that they're going to show up and, the United States isn't going to exist and the Cold War would have, been, not that kind of stuff, because I don't think that's actually what really changes. But they're, right, and in Shadow, I think you've already seen little bits of that, right? So there are ways in which they can't erase that presence they've had in the past, nor should they. Because again, they've changed things forever by doing this. Now, for those of you who are worried that Matthew Claremont that was and Matthew Claremont that will be are going to meet and explode in some kind of cataclysmic time travel event, no, because I actually used a different theory of time travel that's nonlinear. And I think it's led to some confusion because, look, Diana, Matthew, Sarah, all the people who talk about time travel actually aren't physicists. So their experience of doing time travel is that somehow they show up in a different past and the other one is just poof, gone, magically disappeared. The way Sarah describes it is it's like changing trains. You get off the train and your corresponding one gets off it. That, I think, is because, for me, you read all the time travel theories and it's extremely difficult to imagine what it would be like to experience it, but what I used was something called the multi-world interpretation of quantum mechanics. There will be no quiz. And what this basically says is that time is sort of like, the way I see it is like a river with an infinite number of branches, creeks and little tributaries off it, or a tree with an infinite number of branches, and that each time you make a decision, you sort of force an alternative reality into existence, so that everything that ever could have been actually is somewhere in some alternate reality. And so, but that's kind of, again, unless you're a physicist, who's walking around with that kind of sense of what time travel would involve? So that's where we get that little bit of a question about, what's really going to happen or go on. Yes, question?
I read somewhere that quite a few pages you had to edit down Discovery of Witches. Is there any major plot line or something you had to give up?
Is there anything I had to give up when I chopped 300 pages off of Discovery? The answer is oddly no. What I was left with is a kind of huge pile of ands, thes, buts, places where, for those of you who think I'm already too descriptive, where I'd actually describe something 7 times and we only kept 2 of them because I insisted. So, it was just really just overwritten. The one thing that left the book entirely was there was one more changing point of view scene that involved Matthew and Domenico's argument outside Septur. But it actually turned out, it didn't tell you anything you didn't find out otherwise. So it was like 9 pages of just stuff where it didn't matter. So alas, there is no sort of author's cut of the book that you would want to read. So, too bad. Yes?
I wondered if you could reflect kind of personally on your own experience of having gone from being a professor of history in a very academic setting to being one of those authors in the airport, with your books all over the wall of the bookstore, and what that's been like for you.
Okay, so what has this been like for a middle-aged college professor? It's been a little weird in some ways, in other ways not. So and that's part of what I grapple with now. So for example, what I'm doing right now, this feels very much like what I do in the classroom. I show up, miraculously there are people there. They've all read the same book in an ideal universe, right? I then talk about the book and some ideas, I answer questions, and then everyone goes home. So this feels like teaching, although with a really big classroom. Because I keep thinking, wow, you're kind of, there's a lot of you, there's a lot more of you than there are in my classroom. So that feels really normal. And writing and getting up in the morning and answering your questions on Facebook and, doing all, that feels like my life, just with a big classroom. Being in the airport and being recognized by TSA personnel, not that it gets you through the line any quicker, seeing your book up, that's really weird. Seeing yourself in magazines is very weird. And I try to ignore that part and just focus on this part, because this is the part that feels real. I read, I tell stories, I write them down, I talk about books. That all works for me, and then I don't have those sort of surreal moments where I avoid as many of them as possible. Good question. Yes.
Is there a movie deal, and are you gonna wait until after the third book, and who's gonna play Matthew?
So that was a kind of all-encompassing question that basically can be boiled down to, so what about the movie thing? Okay, so what about the movie thing? About this time last year, I signed the trilogy over to Warner Brothers Pictures, who have some experience with bringing books into movies. A few. And they attached producers to the project. Their names are Denise Denovi and Allison Greenspan. For those of you for whom you do not pay attention to the names of producers, these are the women who individually and collectively brought you such films as the Michael Keaton Batman, Edward Scissorhands, The Little Women with Winona Ryder in it, Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, and Practical Magic. So they also have a pretty good track record with taking books and turning them into movies. And right now we're in script development. So they hired a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright named David Auburn, who wrote a play called Proof, to do the screenplay. Exactly. Right? So yeah, so right now you're thinking, okay, magic pixie dust, keep up, or let's not run out of that supply. So this is really unusual. They hired him in the fall. We agreed to the terms of the deal. Then there was reams of paperwork, and then as soon as that ink was dry, they hired David Auburn. He's been working on it since November. And, we're in that script revising process. When it meets the approval of the film studio, they will then get a director, and they will then cast it, and then they will film it, if the pixie dust holds up. And as for who will play any of these parts, I have absolutely no idea. I always say to people, have you ever tried to call a meeting at work and you can't get 4 people in the same room because of conflicting schedules? How does anybody make a movie? It's like 275 people for 5 weeks. I don't get it. So I'm not going to even speculate, and I'm also not going to tell you my personal preferences because, and I'll tell you why, because I'm a teacher. I'm going to tell you why. It's seriously because imagine for a moment you are the poor benighted soul who is cast as Matthew Claremont, and now you have a whole host of problems in your life. And then you sit down at your press junket for your movie, and the interviewer says, so how do you feel about the fact that Deborah Harkness wanted insert actor X's name as Matthew? At this point you're thinking, why did I ever take this part? So instead of that, I'm just going to sort of stay quiet and hope that, like David Auburn, like Denise and Allison, that the trust that Warner Brothers kind of has earned from me, keeps going. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. Think for the best. So, yes.
So when you make the transition from writing about history to writing a story of your own, what's different about the experience for you and kind of that personal investment in your own story versus maybe writing someone else's story?
Okay, so what's the difference between what I do as a historian and what I do as a novelist? Well, in its most crude terms, when I'm a historian, if I get stuck, I have to go to the library and look things up. And as a novelist, if I get stuck, I get to make things up. Now, this sounds great, and in fact, in my pajamas, with my second pot of tea, in my house, it is great, because I don't have to get changed and go to the library. The bad part about it is that I can't really ask any other expert to unstick me. As a historian, I just could do that, right? It was just like, I just would read another article or another book until I was like, oh, okay, I get it, and then I would be unstuck. As a novelist, if it's not working, I'm the only thing that can unstick it. So the good news is I can do it in my jammies. The bad news is the buck stops literally right with me. So that can be a little bit challenging. The other thing is that I get very emotionally involved in the story, and I will tell you.
We do too.
No matter how much I want, writing history drives you crazy. All writing is hard. It's all difficult. There's always problems. No matter how crazy it made me, it never made me cry. And I do, like, come out of my study, kind of when something horrible has happened, or and I think, well, you did it. I'll do it, and it won't get undone. It's very strange. So it's sort of like, wow, who's really in charge? Who's really in charge? I'm going to stick my head. Is there anybody down this little alleyway that has a question? All right. Okay. In the back, lady in the black.
Hi, big fan. I had a question about Discovery of Witches.
Mm-hmm.
What was your reasoning behind when Matthew left and Diana went through her little breakdown? And I felt like she kind of turned into a Bella Swan a little bit.
I get that question a lot too. Here's the thing, guys. We all get to have breakdowns. It doesn't make us weak. It really doesn't. The fact of having a breakdown is not the problem. The fact of having a breakdown is not picking yourself up after it and keeping going. Same thing with falling in love. We all get to be gooey idiots. It's one of life's greatest joys to have those 30 days when you're like, I love baseball. I love all your friends. I love your enchiladas. I love everything about you. And then afterwards you're like, actually, no more baseball ever. It's part of it. And I think sometimes people think that like they've settled down for like, they fix on that one thing. They're like, oh my God, she's lost it. Well, no. She's just had a momentary lapse. And we all have them. And if we have a fictional universe in which none of our heroines have that, then that's like actually really scary to me. Because what it's saying to young women is, you can't have emotions, you can't go all gooey, you can't make bad decisions. Just because she's a professor doesn't mean she's not human. Just because she's a witch doesn't mean it. So thank you so much for asking that question. I have to tell you honestly, I don't have children, so the Twilight thing kind of went by me, and then afterwards everybody was like, it's Twilight for grown-ups. It's so great. And I was like, really? What is that book? I thought, oh my God, it's the book from the wall in Puerto Vallarta. It was by no means a kind of, for her to have a Bella Swan moment. So thank you for asking the question. I really appreciate it. In the back there against the window, yes.
You made two comments. The first is that you're not finished writing the third book, and the second is that it takes you about a year to write a book. So when did you start writing?
When did I start writing book 3? I started writing book 3 in January.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and again, you have to which is really, I started writing Shadow. In actual fact, I started writing it just about the same time that sort of January of 2011. And then I had this little thing to do called the book promotional tour, which went on and on and on. And I can write on planes, but it does slow me down a little bit. So, we're on sort of the same cycle here. And I wrote Discovery in a year as well. So it really does, I'm saying this based on reliable evidence. So, yes ma'am.
Firstly, commendable that you write 600 pages in a year's time. That's like amazing.
It works mathematically, 2 pages a day, it really works.
But then my question was about, so you were talking about how hard it is to do things to your characters. It's always the hardest thing for me to do is like go do something really mean to my character and then not fix it 2 pages later because I feel so bad because you really like your character. So how do you like deal with that kind of experience, or do you have it even?
There are things that happen that I wish could have happened a different way, but by the time I'm actually writing them down, there's a logic to them that it's really the only thing that can possibly happen. So you just kind of can't. You don't get a do-over. It's at the very beginning of Shadow of Night, there's a line from Queen Elizabeth, the past cannot be cured, and it's really true. you kind of, once you know, you've laid, it's like you've laid train track, and there's only one possible destination. Unless you do something really bizarre and gymnastic at the last minute that your readers are gonna go, oh, come on, really? You kind of have to follow through and know that that's somehow just meant to be. So you gotta have the courage of your convictions. I read a book by a woman named Ivy Pacoda called The Art of Disappearing. I don't know if any of you have read it. It was a wonderful book about a woman who fell in love with a stage magician. This is not The Night Circus, this is a different book. And I wanted that book to have a different ending. And I could see where the ending was going. And all the way to the very end I was going, no, go back and get in the van, you know. But you know, she kept going with what the story she wanted to tell. So you have to kind of think highly of that. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned earlier Italian Renaissance that you were teaching. I realize you are still writing a book, but would you be interested in writing another historical story with Italy in mind?
So the question is about what can I imagine writing about other histories, I have a lot more stories to tell. Some of them will probably be nonfiction. Like I may actually one day get back to my story about this plagiarist I was working on at the Early Royal Society, and it will probably be a work of nonfiction. I have other stories that I can imagine telling in all kinds of different ways. So right now, the only thing I can think about is finishing book 3 for you, largely because I get lots of calls, emails, and other things about it. And then I'm going to take a few months and I'm going to stare at a blank wall. And then I'll have, you know, some fresh stories. So I can imagine all kinds of things, but who knows what bizarre, up until September of 2008, I couldn't have imagined. If you'd asked me seriously in July of 2008, so do you think you'll write a vampire book? I would have been like, no. As long as, no. And there I am, so we'll have to just wait and see. Good question.
Has the writing the books and having such a following of people that are just infatuated with your book, has it changed your classroom and your working with the other faculty of the university?
So in addition to how has this changed the life of this middle-aged college professor, how has it changed the life of the middle-aged college professors, colleagues, and students? Well, my students absolutely love the fact that I'm being graded and critiqued by the national news media. So after years and years and years of me grading them, they really like this a whole lot, So they have a lot of fun with me, especially when I get B+. They like that. My colleagues were a little mystified at first. The first question I was asked after I told a few of them that I'd done this was, they said, yeah, but you're not doing this under your own name. And I was like, yeah, I really kind of am. And since then it's been very interesting because now a whole lot of people come out of the closet to me at conferences in the coffee line. So we'll be standing waiting for the coffee and the tea, and somebody will sidle up to me and say, I write cowboy bodice ripper romance. I write mysteries about a woman and a cat living in Arizona. I mean, I just have this constant stream of academics who have confessed that in their spare time they write very, very popular fiction. And so what I'm hoping is that there's a whole lot more people who now maybe feel like they can do this under their own name and not have the hidden life of over there, because that's kind of a shame in a way that you would have to do that.
Okay, we have time for one more.
Yeah.
The title of the third book?
The title of my third book, I do not know it, and even if I thought I knew it, I couldn't tell you because the publisher actually decides the titles. So far they've taken both of my titles. They were really not sure about A Discovery of Witches. They liked Shadow of Night. Discovery of Witches, there were a lot of conversations about it, but nobody could come up with anything better. And so I don't don't know. And it's weird, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, the marketing and publicity department geniuses sit down and I'm sure run it through some kind of algorithmic program or something like that and decide. Because there's just a lot riding on that title selection. So, I don't know. At some point, it'll pop up and it'll be like, oh, that's what the title should be, and then I'll tell them, and then we'll just keep our fingers crossed that's what it all ends up. All right, so we're gonna stop there, just because there's a lot of you, and we wanna make sure to get everybody's book signed and everybody back to their houses in good order. But if you still have a question I didn't get to, you can, of course, ask it in the signing line. And, all right, John.
Well,
I'm gonna
thanks so
turn it over.
much.
Thank you, guys.